Imagine building a kingdom with your own bare hands. You lay every brick, you fight every enemy, you turn a garage hobby into a billion-dollar empire. And then, right when you reach the throne, the guards you hired throw you out the front door. In 1985, Steve Jobs didn't just lose his job, he was publicly humiliated by the very company he created. Most people would have taken their millions and retired, but Steve Jobs wasn't most people. He was about to teach the world a brutal lesson in revenge, resilience, and the art of the comeback. This isn't just the story of the iPhone. This is the story of how a fired founder spent 11 years in the wilderness to master the business of creativity, only to return and build the most valuable company on earth. This story is 7 chapters long, and we hope you love it. Chapter 1, the story of the greatest comeback in business history begins with the end. The date was May 28th. The setting was a sterile boardroom in Cupertino, California. Steve Jobs, the 30-year-old co-founder of Apple Computer, walked into the room believing he was the most important person in the company. He was the face on the magazine covers. He was the visionary behind the Macintosh. He was worth over $200 million. But when he walked out of that room a few hours later, he was nobody. He had just lost a brutal winner-to-call power struggle against John Sculley, the CEO he had personally hired just 2 years earlier. The board of directors, the men who were supposed to support him, looked at the numbers, looked at the chaos Jobs created, and made a cold, hard calculation. They sided with the professional executive over the wild founder. They stripped Jobs of all his operational duties. They took away his team. They took away his product roadmap. They literally moved his office to a remote building on the Apple campus that the employees bitterly called Siberia. He was a chairman with no power, a general with no army. The humiliation was total. He called his girlfriend that afternoon and just cried. He felt like his life was over. He later said it felt like being punched in the stomach and having the wind knocked out of him for 10 years. But to understand why this moment happened and why it was actually the best thing that could have happened to him, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to look at the DNA of a man who was born to be an outsider. Because long before he was fighting John Sculley in a boardroom, he was fighting for his own identity in a garage. To understand the sheer, destructive force of Steve Jobs' ego, you have to go back to the very first deal of his life. It wasn't a business deal, it was his own adoption. In 1955, his biological parents were 2 unmarried graduate students in San Francisco. They were young, they were broke, and they couldn't keep the baby. But his biological mother had one non-negotiable term. Her son had to be adopted by college graduates. She wanted to guarantee his future. A lawyer and his wife were selected. Everything was set. But when Steve was born, they changed their minds. They wanted a girl, so the agency called the next family on the list, Paul and Clara Jobs. Paul Jobs was a high school dropout. He was a repo man and a machinist who fixed cars for fun. Clara was a bookkeeper. They were working-class people living in a modest house in Mountain View. When the biological mother found out they didn't have college degrees, she refused to sign the papers. The deal was dead. Paul and Clara had to hustle. They begged. They negotiated. They swore a solemn oath that they would save every penny to send the boy to college. Finally, she signed. Steve Jobs' life began as a broken contract, salvaged by a desperate promise. He grew up knowing he was chosen, but also knowing he started life as a reject. This created a chip on his shoulder the size of the Golden Gate Bridge. But the real business education didn't happen in school. It happened in his father's garage. Paul Jobs wasn't a tech guy, but he was a master craftsman. He knew how to build things that lasted. He allocated a section of his workbench to Steve. He gave him a hammer and showed him how to work with his hands. One day, they were building a fence or a cabinet. The stories vary, but the lesson is always the same. Paul told Steve to sand and finish the back of the cabinet just as perfectly as the front. Steve was confused. He said, "But Dad, nobody will ever see the back. It's going to be against the wall." And Paul looked at him and said something that would eventually become the entire philosophy of Apple. He said, "You will know. And you will know that you didn't do it right." He taught Steve that true quality isn't about what the customer sees, it's about integrity. It's about fit and finish. You do the work because you respect the product, not just to make the sale. This obsession with the unseen is why, 30 years later, Steve Jobs would scream at engineers for the layout of circuit boards inside the Macintosh that no user would ever open. He learned in that garage that you don't compromise on the product, ever. But while he loved the garage, he hated authority. In school, he was a nightmare. He was bored. He was smarter than the teachers, and he was completely unmanageable. He was a misfit looking for a cause. And in 1971, a mutual friend introduced him to the only other person on the planet who spoke his language. He met a shy, awkward engineering genius named Steve Wozniak, and just like that, the company found its technical co-founder. The partnership between Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak didn't start with a computer. It started with a crime. In 1971, Wozniak read an article in Esquire magazine about a group of hackers called phone phreaks. These guys had figured out that the entire AT&T global phone network was controlled by specific musical tones. If you played the right sound specifically, a frequency of 2600 Hz, you could trick the system into thinking you were a network operator. For Wozniak, this was a pure engineering puzzle. He raced to the library, studied the technical manuals, and built a small battery-powered device called a blue box. It worked perfectly. Wozniak used it to prank call the Vatican, pretending to be Henry Kissinger, asking for the Pope. He was laughing. He was having fun. But Steve Jobs wasn't laughing. He was calculating. He looked at the little box of wires and saw a business model. He turned to Wozniak and said the words that would define their entire future. We could sell these. Wozniak was confused. Sell them to who? Jobs laid out the economics immediately. It cost them about $40 and parts to build one box. He figured they could sell them on the UC Berkeley campus for $150. That is a 275% profit margin. This was the birth of the Apple playbook. Wozniak built the impossible magic, and Jobs packaged it and sold it at a premium. They became the Berkeley Blue Box Company. They went door to door, in the college dorms, hustling illegal tech to students. But this wasn't a lemonade stand. It was dangerous. One night, in a pizza parlor parking lot, a deal went bad. A guy pulled a gun on Steve Jobs. Jobs had to hand over the box and the money just to survive. It was a wake-up call. This was real, high-stakes business. They eventually stopped selling the boxers, but they had cleared about $6,000 in profit. For two kids in the early 70s, that was a fortune. But the money didn't matter. The lesson mattered. Jobs later said, if we hadn't done the blue boxes, there would have been no Apple. It proved that they could take on the biggest corporation in the world, AT&T, and win. It proved that Wozniak's genius was a specialized asset that Jobs could monetize. By 1975, the blue box days were over. Wozniak had moved on to his next hobby. He was attending meetings at the Homebrew Computer Club, a gathering of nerds and engineers who were obsessed with the new microchips coming out of Silicon Valley. Wozniak wanted to show off his latest invention to his friends for free. Jobs looked at the invention and saw the future of humanity. Chapter 2. By 1975. The blue box money was gone, but the partnership was just waking up. Steve Wozniak had found his tribe at the Homebrew Computer Club. This was a group of engineers and hobbyists who met in a rented hall to show off their circuit boards. One night, Wozniak brought in a schematic. It was a design for a computer terminal that could display characters on a TV screen. It was brilliant. Wozniak's instinct was pure. He wanted to give the schematics away for free. He wanted to share his genius with his friends so they could build their own. But Steve Jobs wasn't a hobbyist. He was a shark. He looked around that room and he didn't see friends. He saw a market. He pulled Wozniak aside and said, "Are you crazy? We shouldn't give this away. We should sell it." This was the first fundamental disagreement between the artist and the businessman. Jobs convinced Wozniak that they shouldn't sell the plans. They should sell the printed circuit boards. They decided to form a company. But they had a problem. They had zero capital. This is the moment of true commitment. To raise the seed money, Steve Jobs sold his only real asset, his Volkswagen Microbus. He got a few $100s for it. Steve Wozniak sold his most prized possession, his HP 65 scientific calculator. He got $500. They scraped together $1,300. That was the entire seed capital for Apple Computer. On April 1, 1976, April Fool's Day, they signed the partnership papers. Their headquarters was the garage of Paul Jobs. But having a company and having a customer are two different things. Jobs, barefoot and intense, walked into the Byte Shop, one of the only computer stores in existence. He pitched the owner, Paul Terrell, on buying their circuit boards. Terrell looked at him and said something that changed the entire business model of the industry. He said, "I don't want circuit boards. My customers don't want to solder chips. They want to use the computer." He told Jobs, "If you deliver 50 fully assembled computers, I will pay you $500 each." That was a $25,000 purchase order. It was a fortune. Jobs immediately said yes. He walked out of the store and realized he was in a massive hole. He had a purchase order, but he had no cash to buy the expensive parts needed to build 50 computers. And the deal was net 30. Terrell would only pay him after delivery. So Jobs pulled off his first great financial maneuver. He went to an electronics parts distributor. He showed them the purchase order from the Byte Shop. He used the promise of the future money to secure $20,000 worth of parts on credit. It was a high-wire act. If he failed to build the computers in 30 days, or if the Byte Shop refused to pay, Apple would be bankrupt before it even started. They turned the garage into a factory. Paul Jobs, the perfectionist father, even helped build the wooden burning box for the circuit boards. They worked day and night. They delivered the 50 computers to Paul Terrell just in time. Terrell paid them. They paid the parts supplier. And just like that, they were in business. They had proven they could execute. But Jobs looked at the Apple I and knew it was a dead end. It was a kit for nerds. He wanted to sell to the world, and to do that, he needed millions of dollars. The Apple I was a success for a garage business, but for Steve Jobs, it was already obsolete. It was a circuit board for hobbyists. Jobs looked at the market and saw a massive gap. He didn't want to sell to geeks who owned soldering irons. He wanted to sell to their neighbors. He wanted to build a computer that was an appliance, something you could pull out of a box, plug in, and use. He went to Wozniak, who had already designed a new, far superior circuit board that could display color graphics. It was a masterpiece of engineering economy. But Jobs imposed a constraint that would change the industry. He demanded a case, not a wood box, and not a sheet metal box like the competitors. He wanted a sleek, molded plastic case that looked like a kitchen appliance. He wanted it to look friendly. The problem was the cost. The mold for the plastic case alone cost $100,000. The company had zero credit. The banks laughed at them. The venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road kicked them out of their offices. Jobs realized they couldn't bootstrap this anymore. They needed smart money. Enter Mike Markula. Markula was a retired Intel executive, a millionaire at 32. He visited the garage, looked at Wozniak's prototype, and he didn't see a toy. He saw a Fortune 500 company. He became the adult supervision. He invested $92,000 of his own cash and secured a $250,000 line of credit. In exchange, he took a third of the company. Apple was no longer a partnership. It was a corporation. They launched the Apple II at the West Coast Computer Fair in 1977, while other companies had card tables. Jobs spent their entire marketing budget on a sleek, illuminated plexiglass booth. He understood perception management before he understood management. The Apple II was a hit, but it wasn't an explosion. Not yet. The explosion happened in 1979, thanks to something Apple didn't even build. It was a piece of software called VisiCalc, world's first spreadsheet. Suddenly, the Apple II wasn't just a machine for playing games. It was a machine for business. Accountants and small business owners had to buy a $2,000 computer just to run a $100 piece of software. Sales went vertical. In 1977, sales were $2.7 million. By 1980, they were $117 million. On December 12, 1980, Apple went public. It was the biggest IPO since Ford Motor Company. In a single morning, 300 people became millionaires, and Steve Jobs. At age 25, his net worth hit $256 million. This is the pivotal moment of the tragedy. The market validated Steve Jobs completely. It told him that his intuition, his abrasiveness, and his reality distortion field, his ability to bully people into doing the impossible, was worth $250 million. He believed he could do no wrong. He believed the rules of business didn't apply to him. He was about to take that hubris and pour it into a new project, a computer named after his daughter, Lisa. And he was about to learn that the market can destroy you just as fast as it can make you. Chapter 3. It is 1979. Steve Jobs is rich, famous, and completely bored. The Apple II is printing money, but to Jobs, it's already a relic. It's a beige box. It's Wozniak's machine, not his. He wants to build something that changes the trajectory of human history. He hears rumors about a research lab in Palo Alto called Xerox PARC. People say they are building the future, so Jobs makes a deal. He offers Xerox a pre-IPO investment opportunity. They can invest $1 million in Apple stock, but in exchange, they have to give him and his engineers a full open-door tour of their secret lab. Xerox executives think they are getting a great financial deal. They have no idea they are selling the keys to the kingdom. When Jobs walks into Xerox PARC, he sees three things. He sees networked computers, he sees object-oriented programming, but he barely notices them. He is fixated on the third thing. He sees a screen that doesn't have green command lines. It has windows, it has icons, and the engineer is controlling it all with a strange plastic brick rolling on the table, a mouse. It was the graphical user interface GUI. For the Xerox engineers, this was a cool research project. For Steve Jobs, it was a religious experience. He started screaming at them, "Why aren't you doing anything with this? This is the greatest thing. This is it." He ran back to Apple and effectively redirected the entire company. He was going to steal this idea, refine it, and sell it to the world. He hijacked a project called Elisa, named after the daughter he was refusing to acknowledge at the time. He unleashed the full force of his reality distortion field on the engineering team. He demanded perfection. He demanded a mouse that didn't cost $300 like the Xerox one, but $15. He demanded fonts. He demanded beauty. But here is the brutal business lesson. Innovation creates value, but execution captures it. The Lisa team delivered the machine Jobs wanted. It was beautiful. It was revolutionary. It was the first computer to use a mouse and a GUI, but when it launched in 1983, it had one fatal flaw. The price tag was $9,995. Adjusted for inflation, that is nearly $30,000 today. It was an economic disaster. It was slower than the Apple II and cost 5 times as much. The only people who bought it were NASA and a few wealthy universities. The inventory piled up in warehouses. The board of directors panicked. They looked at the sales numbers and realized their golden boy had just set a mountain of cash on fire. So, they did the unthinkable. They removed the founder from his own project. They kicked Steve Jobs off the Lisa team. It was a demotion. He was a chairman with no operational role. He was humiliated. But Steve Jobs didn't leave. He went looking for a lifeboat. He found a tiny, underfunded project in a different building called the Macintosh. It was run by a brilliant engineer named Jeff Raskin who wanted to build a cheap appliance computer. Jobs didn't join the team. He conquered it. He pushed Raskin out. He took over. He gathered the team and told them, it's better to be a pirate than to join the Navy. The Navy was the rest of Apple, the corporate suits, the Apple II team, the people who had just fired him from the Lisa. The Macintosh wasn't just a product anymore. It was a revenge vessel. Exiled from the main company, Steve Jobs retreated to a separate building on the Apple campus. He didn't sulk. He read with Messina. He gathered the Macintosh team, a small group of brilliant artists, musicians, and engineers, and declared war on his own company. He famously said, it's better to be a pirate than to join the Navy. They literally hoisted a pirate flag over their building. The Navy was the Apple II division, the people paying the bills. The pirates were the Mac team burning cash to build the future. Jobs created a culture of fanaticism. They worked 90-hour weeks, fueled by fresh squeezed juice and the terrifying stare of their leader. But Jobs knew that to beat IBM, he needed more than pirates. He needed a heavy hitter to run the business side. He needed a CEO who understood marketing on a global scale. He set his sights on John Sculley, the CEO of Pepsi-Cola. Sculley was a corporate titan. He had won the cola wars against Coke. He was safe, he was expensive, and he had zero interest in running a chaotic computer startup. Jobs courted him for months. Finally, in a penthouse in New York, Jobs dropped the bomb. He looked Sculley in the eye and delivered the most lethal recruiting pitch in history. Do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life? Or do you want to come with me and change the world? Sculley was stunned. He took the job. Jobs thought he had hired a partner. In reality, he had just hired the man who would sign his execution papers. With his CEO in place, Jobs prepared for the launch. He bet everything on a single commercial. He hired Ridley Scott, the director of Blade Runner, to film a 60-second spot called 1984. It depicted a dystopian world where mindless drones stared at a giant screen, smashed by a hammer-wielding heroine representing the Mac. The cost was unprecedented. $1.5 million and $1,983 for the production and the Super Bowl airtime. When the Apple board of directors saw the ad, they hated it. They were terrified. They told the marketing team to sell off the airtime and kill the commercial. But Jobs and his team disobeyed the order. They ran it anyway. It aired once during the Super Bowl. It was a cultural nuclear bomb. It generated millions of dollars in free press. A few days later, Jobs took the stage at the shareholder meeting. He pulled the Macintosh out of a bag. He inserted a floppy disk. And for the first time in history, a computer spoke to the audience. Hello, I am Macintosh. The crowd screamed. People wept. It was the greatest product launch of the 20th century. Steve Jobs had won the media war. But the next morning, the reality of the business set in. Marketing gets the customer to the door. The product has to close the deal. And the Macintosh was flawed. The morning after the launch, the reality set in. The Macintosh was a marketing triumph, but it was a technological disaster. It was beautiful, but it was slow. It had almost no memory. It had no hard drive, and it cost $2,500. Consumers looked at the Mac, and then they bought an IBM PC for half the price. By the end of 1984, sales plummeted. The inventory piled up in warehouses. The company was bleeding cash. Steve Jobs did not handle the failure well. He panicked. He blamed the marketing. He blamed the price. He demanded that John Sculley lower the price of the Macintosh and shift millions of dollars from the profitable Apple II division to prop up his failing Mac division. Sculley refused. He looked at the balance sheet and saw a dangerous lack of discipline. He told Jobs that the company needed stability, not more gambling. The partnership was over. It was now a war. In May 1985, Jobs decided to stage a coup. He organized a secret plan to get the board of directors to fire John Sculley while Sculley was away on a business trip to China. But Jobs made a critical mistake. He told his plan to an executive he thought was loyal. That executive went straight to Sculley and told him everything. Sculley canceled his trip. He walked into the next board meeting and confronted Jobs in front of the entire leadership team. He forced the board to choose. He told them, it is Steve, or it is me. The board looked at the numbers. They saw a founder who was out of control. They saw a manager who was trying to save the company. They voted. Every single one of them sided with Sculley. They stripped Steve Jobs of all operational power. They fired him from the Macintosh team. They moved his office to an empty building famously called Siberia. He was the chairman, but he wasn't allowed to run anything. He was 30 years old, and he had just been publicly exiled from the empire he built. He resigned 4 months later. He sold his stock, he was gone. For most people, this is where the career ends. But for Steve Jobs, the failure was a necessary ingredient. He took his money and started a new company called Next. He wanted revenge. He wanted to show Apple they were wrong. But he was about to make the exact same mistake all over again. Chapter 4. In September 1985, Steve Jobs was a man without a country. He was 30 years old, and he had just been publicly humiliated by the company he founded. He cashed out. He sold all of his Apple stock, keeping only a single share. He walked away with $100 million in liquid cash. For most people, this is the end of the line. They retire. They buy yachts. They join boards. But Steve Jobs was not motivated by money. He was motivated by revenge. He decided to start a new company immediately. He called it Next. His goal was simple and aggressive. He wanted to build a computer that was so advanced and so beautiful that it would make the Macintosh look like a toy. He wanted to prove to the Apple board that they had bet on the wrong man. He took 5 of his most loyal senior engineers from Apple and set up shop. But this time, there was a dangerous difference. At Apple, he had a board of directors and investors to tell him no. At Next, he was the sole investor. There was no one to stop him. He immediately fell into the trap of perfectionism. He focused on everything except the customer. His first major expenditure was not on research or engineering, it was on a logo. He hired Paul Rand, the most famous graphic designer in the world. He paid him $100,000 just to design a black square with the word Next inside it. He then built a factory. But this wasn't just a factory, it was a palace. He demanded that the assembly line robots be painted in specific designer colors. He insisted on walls that were museum-quality white. He spent millions of dollars building a manufacturing cathedral before he had a single order for a computer. When the Next computer finally launched in 1988, it was a stunning piece of hardware. It was a perfect, 1-foot magnesium black cube, but the price tag was $6,500. He had built a machine for students that no student could afford. The market reaction was cold. The press loved the design, but businesses ignored it. They didn't need a black cube. They needed computers that ran common software. Sales were non-existent. The factory sat empty. The robots had nothing to do. By 1993, the dream was dead. The hardware division of Next was shut down. Steve Jobs had burned through millions of dollars of his own fortune to prove a point, and he had failed again. His reputation was in tatters. The business world saw him as a has-been, a guy who got lucky once with the Apple II and then struck out twice. But while Next was bleeding money, Steve Jobs had made another investment. It was a small side bet that he paid very little attention to. It was a group of computer scientists he bought from George Lucas. He thought they were going to sell hardware. He was wrong. While Next was burning cash, Steve Jobs had acquired a small division of Lucasfilm in 1986 for $10 million. He named it Pixar. For years, Pixar was a financial disaster. It was losing money every month. Jobs tried to sell it multiple times to recoup his losses. He saw it as a hardware company that couldn't sell its image processors. But the team at Pixar, led by John Lasseter, had a different vision. They didn't want to sell computers. They wanted to make movies. In a moment of rare concession, Jobs allowed them to sign a deal with Disney to produce a fully computer-animated feature film. That film was Toy Story. When Toy Story was released in November 1995, it was an instant, global phenomenon. It changed the film industry overnight. Jobs, recognizing the momentum, executed a masterstroke of timing. Just 1 week after the movie release, he took Pixar public. The IPO was massive. By the end of the day, Steve Jobs' 80% stake in Pixar was worth $1.1 billion. The irony was absolute. The man who wanted to be the king of hardware became a billionaire selling cartoons. His main venture, Next, was a failure. His side hustle, Pixar, was a triumph. This wealth gave him something he had lost in 1985: leverage. Meanwhile, back in Cupertino, Apple Computer was dying. Since firing Jobs, the company had drifted into mediocrity. They had lost their edge. They were losing market share to Microsoft Windows at a terrifying rate. By 1996, the new CEO, Gil Amelio, faced a catastrophe. Apple's internal operating system was outdated and buggy. Their engineers had failed to build a replacement. The company was literally 90 days away from bankruptcy. Amelio realized they had to buy an operating system from the outside. They looked at the market. They saw a stable, powerful, object-oriented system called NextStep. It belonged to the failed hardware company, Next. In December 1996, Gil Amelio made the phone call that changed history. He called Steve Jobs. He didn't want the founder. He wanted the software. Apple agreed to purchase Next for $429 million. Steve Jobs negotiated a specific condition. He would not just take the cash. He would return to Apple as a special advisor to the chairman. It was a Trojan horse maneuver. Steve Jobs was back inside the building. He had no operational power, no title, and no authority. But he had the one thing the board lacked: a vision for survival. The shark was back in the tank. Chapter 5. Steve Jobs walked back into Apple Computer in early 1997, but he wasn't the boss. He was a special advisor. He didn't have an office. He didn't have a team. But he had something more powerful. He had the board's terrified attention. The company was bleeding cash. The stock was at a 12-year low. The current CEO, Gil Amelio, was paralyzed by the complexity of the organization. Jobs spent his first few weeks just walking around. He looked at the product roadmap. He looked at the teams. He saw a company that had forgotten how to say no. In July 1997, the board of directors had seen enough. They fired Gil Amelio. They immediately turned to Steve Jobs. They begged him to take the CEO job. This was the moment Jobs had waited 12 years for. He had the crown offered to him on a platter. But he did something unexpected. He refused. He told them he was the CEO of Pixar. He was a billionaire. He didn't have time to save a dying computer company. This was the ultimate negotiation tactic. By walking away, he increased his value. Finally, he agreed to a temporary arrangement. He would serve as the interim CEO, or ICEO. He demanded a salary of exactly $1 per year. He didn't want the salary, he wanted the moral authority. By taking $1, he signaled to the employees and the shareholders that he wasn't there for the money, he was there for the mission. And then, the purge began. Jobs called a product strategy meeting. He looked at the walls covered in roadmaps for dozens of products, printers, scanners, servers, handhelds, and 12 different versions of the Macintosh. He grabbed a marker and walked to the whiteboard. He drew a simple cross, creating a 2x2 grid. He wrote Consumer and Pro on the top. He wrote Desktop and Portable on the side. He told the room, "This is it. We are building for products. We are killing everything else." The room went silent. He was canceling 70% of the company's products. He was firing thousands of people. He was shutting down profitable lines because they lacked focus. The board was terrified. They thought he was shrinking the company to death. But Jobs understood a fundamental law of business. Focus does not mean saying yes, it means saying no. He stopped the bleeding. He stabilized the finances. And then, he prepared to launch the first product of the new era. He needed a computer that didn't look like a computer. The purge was over. The company was lean. Now, Steve Jobs needed a hit. He found a young, frustrated British designer in the basement of Apple's headquarters named Jony Ive. Ive was ready to quit, but Jobs looked at his prototypes and saw the future. He gave Ive absolute protection and a simple mandate: make it beautiful. In 1998, they unveiled the iMac. It broke every rule of the industry. Computers were beige boxes hidden under desks. The iMac was a translucent Bondi blue teardrop that sat on top of the desk. It had a handle. It looked like candy. But Jobs made a terrifying technical bet. He killed the floppy drive. The floppy disk was the global standard for moving files. Removing it was considered suicide. But Jobs insisted the future was the internet. That's what the I stood for. The gamble paid off. The iMac sold 800,000 units in 5 months. It saved the company. Apple turned its first profit in years. With the cash flow secured, Jobs shifted his strategy. He didn't just want to sell computers. He wanted to own the consumer's entire digital life. He called it the digital hub strategy. In 2001, he launched the iPod. Critics mocked it. They said no wireless. Less space than a Nomad. Lame. But they missed the point. The iPod wasn't about the hardware. It was about the ecosystem. It put 1,000 songs in your pocket with a scroll wheel that was pure genius. Jobs then did what no other CEO could do. He flew to New York and strong-armed the music labels. He convinced them to sell individual songs for 99 cents on the iTunes store. He ended music piracy by making it easier to buy than to steal. But the ultimate test of a CEO is the ability to destroy your own creation before someone else does. By 2005, the iPod was generating 45% of Apple's revenue. It was a cash machine. But Jobs saw a threat. Mobile phones were getting smarter. Soon they would play music. If that happened, the iPod would be obsolete. Most CEOs would protect the cash cow. Jobs decided to kill it. He initiated a secret project to put a phone inside an iPod. He cannibalized his own best-selling product to build the future. On January 9, 2007, Steve Jobs took the stage at the Moscone Center. He told the audience, "Today, we are introducing 3 revolutionary products: an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator." He repeated it until they got it. These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device. And we are calling it iPhone. The iPhone vaporized the competition. Nokia, Motorola, BlackBerry companies worth billions were effectively destroyed in a few years. Steve Jobs had completed the greatest turnaround in corporate history. He had taken a company 90 days from bankruptcy and set it on a path to become the first $1 trillion company on Earth. He was on top of the world. He was the god of tech, but while he was unveiling the future, he was hiding a dark secret about his own timeline. Chapter 6. By 2003, Steve Jobs was untouchable. He was the CEO of Apple and the CEO of Pixar. He had revolutionized the personal computer with the iMac and the music industry with the iPod. The Apple stock price was climbing toward the stratosphere. He had proven everyone wrong. He had bent the market, the critics, and the technology to his will. But in October 2003, reality finally pushed back. During a routine checkup, doctors noticed a shadow on his pancreas. The diagnosis was terrifying: pancreatic cancer. Usually, this is a death sentence. It is aggressive, fast, and incurable. The doctors told him to get his affairs in order. But later that day, they performed a biopsy, sticking a needle into the tumor to get cells. When the doctors looked under the microscope, they started crying. It was a miracle. Jobs didn't have the common adenocarcinoma, he had a neuroendocrine tumor. This was a rare, slow-growing form of cancer, and most importantly, it was curable. The doctors told him the solution was simple: surgery. They could cut it out, and he would likely live a normal life. Any other person on Earth would have been wheeled into the operating room that afternoon. But Steve Jobs said no. This is the moment where a superpower became his fatal flaw. For 30 years, Steve Jobs had succeeded by refusing to accept facts. When engineers said a plastic case couldn't be molded, he stared them down until they did it. When the music industry said they wouldn't sell songs for 99 cents, he forced them to. He believed that if you ignored a reality you didn't like, you could change it. He decided to treat his cancer like a product design problem. He didn't want his body to be violated by surgery. He wanted to fix it himself. For 9 months, while the tumor sat inside him, Steve Jobs tried to hack his biology. He went on strict vegan diets. He ate only fruit for weeks. He consulted with psychics. He used acupuncture and herbal remedies. His friends, his wife, and the Apple board were terrified. They begged him to get the surgery. They yelled at him, but the reality distortion field was turned inward. He truly believed that through pure will and diet, he could starve the cancer. In July 2004, a CAT scan revealed the truth. The distortion field had failed. The tumor had grown. It had likely spread to his liver. He finally agreed to the surgery, but the window of opportunity had closed. The manageable problem was now a terminal condition. He had negotiated with terrorists, billionaires, and emperors, and won every time. But he couldn't negotiate with biology. After the surgery in 2004, Jobs told the world he was cured. He wasn't. The cancer had metastasized. For the next 7 years, Steve Jobs was living on borrowed time. He knew the clock was ticking, and instead of slowing down, he accelerated. He kept his illness a secret from the public and even from most of his employees. He didn't want pity. He wanted product shipping dates. In 2009, his health collapsed. He was skeletal. He took a medical leave of absence to receive a liver transplant. The media speculated he was finished. They wrote his professional obituary. But 6 months later, he walked back onto the stage in San Francisco. He looked frail, but his eyes were burning. He had one last product to give the world. On January 27, 2010, he unveiled the iPad. Critics laughed again. They called it a big iPhone. They asked, "Who needs this?" Jobs ignored them. He knew that this was the ultimate expression of his vision, a simple sheet of glass that could be anything you wanted it to be. It was the computer for the rest of us. Perfected. He sat in a chair on stage, scrolling through the New York Times, showing the world the future of media. He was dying, but he was still the best salesman on earth. The iPad sold 3 million units in 80 days. By 2011, Apple had surpassed ExxonMobil to become the most valuable company on the planet. Steve Jobs had won. He had taken a company that was 90 days from death and turned it into the economic engine of the modern world. But his body had nothing left to give. On August 24, 2011, he wrote a simple letter to the board of directors. He wrote, "I have always said if there ever came a day when I could no longer meet my duties and expectations as Apple's CEO, I would be the first to let you know. Unfortunately, that day has come." He handed the CEO title to Tim Cook, the operational genius he had hired to build Apple's supply chain. He knew Cook wasn't a visionary, but he also knew Cook would protect the company. 6 weeks later, on October 5, 2011, Steve Jobs died at his home in Palo Alto. He was 56 years old. The reaction was unprecedented. People didn't just mourn a CEO. They mourned him like a rock star or a president. They left flowers and apples at Apple stores around the world. They held up their iPhones devices that did unexist 4 years earlier to light up the night in his honor. His final legacy wasn't the money, it wasn't the products, it was the lesson. He proved that you don't have to listen to focus groups. You don't have to follow the rules. You can get fired, you can fail, you can be humiliated, and you can still come back and change everything. Steve Jobs started as an unwanted baby in a garage and ended as the architect of the future. And he did it by believing, against all evidence, that the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.